Welcome everybody to Tushita Talks to the World. My guest tonight is Victoria Schofield, who is an author, historian and commentator on international affairs with specialist and deep knowledge of South Asia. Victoria has travelled widely in Pakistan, India and Afghanistan, and is a leading international expert on the disputed former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. Victoria's latest book is titled The Fragrance of Tears, which details her close, enduring and deep friendship with the late Benazir Bhutto. I first heard of Victoria in 1996 when I started doing research for my PhD at La Trobe University in Melbourne. And I came across an excellent book that Victoria had just had published called, let me get this in the right position, Kashmir in the Crossfire, which is, I think you've now done 5 editions of this, which is significant. It's a wonderful, detailed account of what's gone on in Jammu and Kashmir since 1947 and a bit beyond that, but certainly particularly since 1947. I first actually met Victoria in January 2014 at the National Defence University in Islamabad, Pakistan, where we were both participating in a conference. And we again met and presented together in Honolulu in November 2016. So I've been very lucky. I've known you for longer than I've actually met you, Victoria, but it's every time I meet you, I enjoy hearing your stories and your thoughts and your opinions. So I wanted to start tonight by not talking about Benazir Bhutto, which we'll get on to later, and that's your new book, but about Kashmir. Now, I know in your book you mentioned that you first went to Pakistan, then went to Kashmir, but in our relationship, I met you in Pakistan first, but I heard of you because of Kashmir. So this dispute's now been going on for 73 years, and some of my friends have told me it could go on for another 73 years. What's your feeling about this particular dispute nowadays?
Well, firstly, Chris, it's wonderful to be talking to you, and wonderful that we can reach out through these technical processes. And greetings to all the listeners in Australia. Kashmir, it sort of gets into your blood, I think, and you worry about it. You lie in bed worrying about it late at night because you do see it as an unending issue. And going back to that first book in 1996, I decided to write on the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir because I was involved in Pakistan. I was working as a journalist, and I identified this issue as something I could work on, which involved both Pakistan and India. But at the same time, and again, you've mentioned my friendship with Benazir Bhutto, wasn't directly related to her, but it was an issue that would make me keep coming back to the subcontinent, to South Asia. And having also traveled in India, in my naivety back then, I thought, well, why are these countries still fighting over an issue which should have been resolved at independence in 1947? And I wanted to get to grips with it so that, in a way, my own knowledge was better than the rhetoric of what I heard in Pakistan and then what I heard in India. And that's really why I began to work on Kashmir. And I was lucky enough, I had friends there, I traveled there. And then, of course, the issue itself hit the headlines in the late 1980s, 1990s, when an insurgency began against the Indian government. But even at that time, I was still feeling that if I write a book, if I point out the inconsistencies, if I in a way, encourage people to jettison the baggage of history. And as we know with conflict resolution, draw a line under the hatred, under the antipathy. It would be obviously in their interest to move forward, that they would want to move forward. But I'm afraid to say that 5 books later, because you're right, I am bringing out that book again in its 5th edition early next year. And older as I am now, I am beginning to feel that actually there isn't the will, there isn't the political will. It needs the political will at a very, very high level to set aside all the rhetoric and all the hatred and all the disaffection and dissatisfaction, and really to say, we have to resolve this issue for the betterment of all our peoples in South Asia. But I'm afraid, having studied it for so many years, I don't see that political will anymore. If anything, I see a pulling apart. And so I hate to be pessimistic, particularly at the beginning of an interview, but I really don't see it at the moment. And I don't see it particularly with the current situation in India and the current government. There was a sort of a bit of light at the end of a tunnel in 2004, 5, 6, 7, when then President Musharraf started talking to his Indian counterpart, and there was a sort of attempt at reconciliation. But that window of opportunity was lost. And I think this is what we've learned about politics at such a high level. You have a window of opportunity. If you don't seize the moment, the situation moves on.
So look, I first went to that part of the world in 1994, I think, which unfortunately on the Indian side was after this anti-India insurgency started in 1988, went violent in 1989. But I think you, Victoria, you went there before the insurgency and after the insurgency. Can you tell us a little bit about how the situation had changed in the Kashmir Valley during that particular time? Or as a result of both of those visits?
Yes, well, 1981 was my first visit, in fact, and it was again happenstance. I'd met a young Kashmiri. I was working for BBC. I'd gone to India with a series of packages of interviews I wanted to undertake, and I thought, well, while I'm about it, I will do a program on Kashmiri textiles. That's what we thought about when we thought about Kashmir Valley. We thought about these beautiful pashmina shawls. In fact, I'm wearing one now. These lovely shawls.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And that's what we thought about. And in fact, I spent a lot of time when I was there on my first visit going to look at this wonderful art of weaving, which, of course, as we know, the particular technique they have is so specialized. And at that time, it was a peaceful place. In fact, it was sort of going into what some people now call one of its golden ages in the early 80s. Sheikh Abdullah was still alive. He'd had the accord with Indira Gandhi. And there was a sort of a sense of peace prevailing. There wasn't the disaffection which took place a decade later, which broke out into the insurgency. I do remember, I didn't have the knowledge I have now, but I remember asking one of these workers, you're Muslim, would you prefer to be with Pakistan? Circumstances, you never had your plebiscite. And I can remember him shaking his head and saying, yes, we never had our plebiscite, but time has passed. And let's also not forget that Pakistan at that time was going through a very difficult period. It was under the dictatorship of General Zia al-Haq. And there were people who looked and thought, well, maybe, we wanted to go with Pakistan in 1947, but now we're just as well off economically where we are. We don't particularly want to join Pakistan on a military dictatorship. If you freeze in time, that was sort of the attitude in the early 80s. But then, of course, we know we had the fallout from the Afghan war. We had the idea of freedom fighting. And up came the issue again, we've never had our right of self-determination. And with a certain amount of, I think, sort of electioneering and gerrymandering of the 1987 election, this disaffection broke out into, we want our right of self-determination. These elections were fraudulent. And as we know, 87 elections led to the 89 uprising. And by the 90s, when I went back, the early 1990s during the insurgency, it was a totally different place. It was militarized. It was not militarized. And again, one has to cast one's mind back to how gorgeous the valley is, and to think about it not having military troops on every street corner, not having the sandbags and barbed wire that you now see. It was just a lovely place, very beautiful, just, up in the Himalayan mountains. But of course, 1990s, it was militarized. There were police and military on every street corner, and the way it's remained to this day. And there was this sense of fear also, and a dejection, because in the early 80s, you'd got tourism, you'd got lots of people coming, famous for its houseboats. But of course, by the 1990s, the tourism had tailed off. And to this day, it remains tailed off. It's never achieved what it achieved in those 1980s and the preceding decades.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. When I went there in 1996, there were 2 hotels, I think, open. And I did actually stay on a houseboat, but I used to go to one of the hotels on the Broadway down near Dal Lake, where a lot of Westerners had previously stayed, and have chai with the hotel owners. And I think I saw one other foreigner when I was there, and it was wonderful in the sense of going to a place where there weren't many foreigners. And that's refreshing, because usually wherever I go, there's a lot of English, Australians, Americans, you name it. They're all, and now increasingly Chinese and Indians traveling. But were you surprised then, having been there during the 80s, that firstly, this uprising began, and then secondly, how motivated many of the Kashmiris, it seemed, were at that stage, and then thirdly, their desire for so-called azadi, by which it's a difficult term to translate, but by which they mean certainly freedom, but it can also mean independence. In other words, they didn't want to join Pakistan nor stay with India. So were you surprised?
Well, yes and no, because having begun by this stage to follow what was going on, and particularly putting it in the context, and as I say, you can choose your sort of political causes, but you can't choose your neighbors. And the fallout from the Afghan jihad, as it's still called, with the Mujahideen, had a tremendous effect. I think it's true to say assisted, and it's now well documented, by the irredentist claims of Pakistan over the former princely state, which date back, as we know, to partition. And this idea that boundaries aren't set in stone. And I remember interviewing people saying, if the Soviet Union can break up, and these stans, the independence of Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and the other stans had a huge impact. If Germany can reunite, that was the other thing. The reunification of Germany played hugely. Why can the state of Jammu and Kashmir not reunite? And you bring back into the history this unheld plebiscite, this idea that we've never had our right of self-determination. And you're absolutely right that the concept of azadi, and it's a word that it is difficult to bring into English. I always feel it's azadi, the freedom to be ourselves, to lead our own lives. And this essentially was the demand, but it became confused when, was it independence? Or was it self-government? Was it autonomy? And of which bit of the state? Because as we know, we talk often liberally about Kashmir, but its correct name is Jammu and Kashmir. But as we both know very well, it includes other areas of different cultural and linguistic origins, all bound together by an accident of conquest and history in 1846 by the British, that has no natural unity. And so I've interviewed dozens of people, and I said, would you want independence of the whole state? Because that would mean Pakistan giving up areas it administers, and India. And then often the response comes, no, just the valley. But the valley is so small, it's 80 miles long, 20 to 25 miles wide. It's tiny, plus it's geographically, it's not like Monaco or Liechtenstein in the heart of Europe, where has sort of flat territory and easy communications. It requires communications with the outside world. So it's such a difficult concept, but as we know, it's taken hold of people's imagination, and it hasn't been properly addressed to this day. And this is why you still have, I'm shocked to realize with bringing out this new edition of my book, that I'm talking to young people fired up who were not born when the insurgency began. And this is again where I go back to the point that this issue has to be addressed, because yet it's landed on another generation and then another generation who get imbued with this spirit of Azadi.
So you mentioned that the term is actually Jammu and Kashmir, the shorthand for which was Kashmir. But one of the things that I think has also increased some of the confusion is now that term Kashmiris. Now, people from the Kashmir Valley, not all of them, but many of them are ethnic Kashmiris. There are also other people like Gujars and Bakarwals who are shepherds, basically, of particularly sheep and goats and also cows. But now you're getting people on the other side, by which I mean the Pakistan administered side, also calling themselves Kashmiris because their forebears have come from this former princely state called Kashmir, which confuses the issue, I think, as well. And my research suggests that when Pakistanis are talking about Kashmir and Kashmiris, they're talking about all of the former princely state and the people in it. For India, though, it's totally the reverse. When they're talking about Kashmir and Kashmiris, invariably they're talking about the Kashmir Valley. So you in the United Kingdom have a Kashmiri diaspora, which we don't have in Australia. And some of those are from the Kashmir Valley, and some of those particularly are from Mirpur, an area in Azad Kashmir. So in your research and travels, have you been to the other side as well, Victoria? And how does that differ from the Indian side?
Well, you're absolutely right. And in fact, Kashmiri as a language is not one of the minor languages of Pakistan, because there were no indigenous Kashmiri speakers in Pakistan after 1947. Those Kashmiri speakers who are there now are those who've migrated. But of course, as you say, politically, they call themselves Kashmiri from Mirpur, even though they don't speak the Kashmiri language, because they are politically part of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And I remember when I was in Azad Kashmir, which for short we call Azad Free Kashmir. It's where the free government was technically set up after the First War in 1947-48. And I remember saying, why is it still AJK? And they've explained to me, because it's Azad Jammu and Kashmir. They call it AJK on the understanding that they would get the rest of the state, so to speak, free. But it's again, one of the anomalies. And I think it just about works for the Mirpuris and the Punchis and the Sudans, but it certainly doesn't work for those people who live in Gilgit-Baltistan, who are politically part of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, but they really would resent themselves being called Kashmiris, because they're not. They're Gilgitis, they're Baltis, they certainly have no affiliation in terms of culture, but it's all because of the political definition of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, really going back to the sort of symbiotic relationship that Jammu had with the Valley of Kashmir, that you'd have the summer capital in Srinagar in the Valley of Kashmir, you'd have the winter capital in Jammu city, in Jammu province, and to this day, the shuttling back and forward to the different capitals, which cements that relationship, which again, when you're talking about independence, is why it's difficult to sort of sever the valley, because it's had this relationship with Jammu as well. So it's a most unusual state, rooted in origin, in its history. And I think, again, it's another reason why for us writers, in order to talk about it, you really have to get to grips with this history and understand it, because a shorthand just doesn't work, because you don't really quite know what you're talking about. You can make all sorts of statements about Kashmir, which aren't exactly valid. And I think for us in Britain, you're absolutely right. We have the very influential Kashmiri diaspora. Certainly they feel entitled to call themselves Kashmiri, but it's a consequence of the compensation they were given at the time when they created the Mangla Dam in order to apportion the waters of the Indus River. And so they came, the lands were flooded, and a lot of them came. And that's why we have such a large Kashmiri community in the UK.
Yeah, that's interesting. But you also have some ethnic Kashmiris there too, don't you, from the valley? They're not just Mirpurs.
Oh, yes. No, definitely. But the majority and the very influential ones who've become Labour councillors and Conservative councillors and have lobbied our government and our MPs, I would say the majority are from Mirpur. But there are certainly some from the valley as well, some Kashmiri speakers.
Well, for those listening, there's actually 7 regions in Jammu and Kashmir. China controls 2, one called Aksai Chin, which has become topical this year because of some skirmishing between Indian forces and Chinese forces. Another area called Shagsgam, way up in the north, that Pakistan ceded to China in 1963. China says if there's a change in the regime, we'll revisit that issue. 2 areas administered by Pakistan, and they administer them Pakistan administers these areas until the United Nations plebiscite is held to determine whether Jammu and Kashmir, or the people of Jammu and Kashmir, will decide to join India or Pakistan. One of those is Gilgit-Baltistan, that Victoria just mentioned. Another is Azad Jammu and Kashmir, Azad Kashmir for short, as we've just been talking about as well. And on the Indian side, there's Jammu, the Kashmir Valley, shorthand for which is Kashmir, and another area, a large area called Ladakh to the east of the Kashmir Valley. So moving forward a little bit, in fact quite a lot, to this year, this year and last year there has been some significant changes. Now, when the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir acceded to India on the 26th of October 1947, India I believe, made a couple of mistakes, one of which was to offer a plebiscite. It was called a reference to the people thereafter, a plebiscite, and then to take the issue to the United Nations, believing that Pakistan's aggression would be censored, but it wasn't. And the aggression was Pakistan allegedly sending Pakhtun raiders in to try and capture Kashmir and or the Maharaja and his accession. And then thereafter, there's been all of these various things that have happened. When the Indian Constitution came into being, they gave Jammu and Kashmir special status, Article 370, which essentially, supposedly anyway, gave them autonomy, which over time has been seriously diluted. But last year, it was curtailed. The Indian government, abrogated Article 370, and also a special Article 335A in the Indian Constitution, which only allowed people in Jammu and Kashmir to buy land and to get government jobs and various other things. So then they also bifurcated the Indian part into 2 territories. The territory of Jammu and Kashmir, which comprises those 2 regions of Jammu and the Kashmir Valley, and Ladakh. So were you expecting that to happen, Victoria, that abrogation, and what do you think of the ramifications?
I was actually in the valley shortly before, and I'm afraid the local people, you know, my friends and friends we have in common, they were fearing it. And I remember thinking, oh no, they wouldn't do this, would they? That would be so inflammatory. But I'm afraid I was warned by friends, because they could sense with this very assertive government of Narendra Modi, it's been in the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the ruling government's manifesto for some time. But it's sort of been one of these things whereby people have thought, well, they won't do it, they won't go ahead with such a drastic measure which will alienate, not win hearts and minds. I mean, let's not forget, since the insurgency, the mantra that the Indian government has been chanting is to win hearts and minds. And doing something like that would certainly not win hearts and minds. But So yes, I was expecting it. I think what I feel, and one of my other friends said, it's like, you know, you've been playing a game of chess since 1947, and Pakistan's been moving its pieces and its pawns, and it's lost some pawns, it's lost a knight or two, and India's been playing from the other side. It's like someone has literally chucked the chessboard, you know, on the floor, and now you've got to start all over again. It is a completely different scenario that we're looking at now, which is why I would emphasize that I think that particular window of opportunity, you know, we've talked about, has gone. And so whatever resolution, so to speak, is going to be in a different format. Because what I think we should emphasize is the new union territories, which India has established out of the former princely state, include on the map as are Jammu and Kashmir, which is part of Kashmir and the Jammu and Kashmir Union Territory. And curiously, I think for those of us interested in ground realities, Ladakh Union Territory includes Gilgit-Baltistan. And as we know, drawing maps for books is a very much a minefield. And so I'm very aware of this at this moment in time, because there's no historical affiliation that Ladakh has ever really had, and no linguistic affiliation with Gilgit-Baltistan. But officially, the new map of the Union Territories doesn't only include those areas administered by India, but it includes those areas administered by Pakistan. And more worrying
and
still.
China. And China
And
as
in
well.
China. And yes, no, there's no recognition of the Shakskan Valley or indeed Aksai Chin. No indication of the line of control which divides Indian and Pakistan administered Kashmir, nor indeed of the line of actual control dividing the areas that China administers. But I think it's symptomatic of how far away we are from resolution when you have a new map produced which doesn't reflect ground realities, and alarming even more so that it's accompanied by statements which have been much more forceful than they've been in the past, that our next objective is to get back Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. And this is appearing regularly in Indian statements. And to counter that, we have the new Pakistan map, which was produced in August this year, which again doesn't reflect ground realities, and alarmingly sort of has Pakistan's northern frontier not defined at all, looking like it marches into the Himalayas. So it's not clear whether they've got a claim on Ladakh or not got a claim on Ladakh, but very clearly identifying the Valley of Kashmir as illegally occupied by India. This has ratcheted up the rhetoric. This has not softened the rhetoric. It's now in 2020 ratcheted up. And so I think the ramifications of what India did in August last year are going to be far-reaching, but I'm afraid I don't see them being reconciliatory. I see them being far more confrontational. And we have to, you know, keep alert as writers and commentators, because we don't quite know what's going to happen. But when you look at the ground realities for the people, the inhabitants who live in this region, it obviously has made life very difficult for them. And I think it's important to emphasize in this day of social media and technical innovation, and how we can talk to each other across the world, how for several months all internet facilities were cut off, and the valley was on total lockdown. Impossible, even with land. They eventually restored the landlines, but mobile phones was all cut off. And that element of communication, if you're putting through a political act which you want to be have the consensus of the people, you don't do that in a situation of lockdown. There was no consultation. It was just preceded by further militarization. This does not, to me, seem to be a happy scenario.
Yes, and they've still only got 2G in many of those districts, so they can't access the sort of thing that you and I are now doing, a Zoom.
No, well, also, because I think one must emphasize at a time of COVID, with the pandemic, because unable, and I know in the early days when COVID broke in the spring this year in India and Pakistan, doctors were trying to download documents that would help them understand what was going on, and they were unable to do so. So there's the human ramifications.
Yeah, and it's affected business, and it's affected students. Absolutely. And all sorts of things. It's been terrible, unfortunately. The other one that some of the locals are concerned about, and just before I ask you this question, though, part of the challenge, as you mentioned, is that the BJP's plan to abrogate this article was in their manifestos going back some time, and they were very clear and very strong about that. So I think one of the challenges for the Kashmiris is, how do they change the Indian mindset? Because it's incredibly popular. The BJP was re-elected with an increased majority, and arguably they do have a mandate to do what they've done. And it's not popular with people in the valley, but it is popular with a lot of Indians. And I think the BJP government just wants to make them, and wants Kashmiris to be, ordinary Indians, whatever an ordinary Indian is. So that's part of the challenge.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, as Prime Minister Modi said when he addressed the nation, he said, you know, this the separateness, the Article 370, the special status, was causing separatism and causing, you know, Kashmiris not to feel Indian. And that was technically the idea behind it. But of course, the way it was done has just caused further alienation. And I agree, a lot of Indians, you know, they didn't like the fact that Kashmir had this special status, because they thought, well, they're no more special than anybody else. But again, that's why one goes back to the history as to the circumstances under which the Maharaja agreed to accede to India. There were specific circumstances. But I think it's also important, it's more psychological. And as you've mentioned, what gets in the mind is so difficult to change on all sides, because actually that special status, as you suggested, had been long since really eroded. And there were just symbolic elements left. And it's really those symbolic elements which have been taken away, but they meant an awful lot to the inhabitants of the state. And I think it's how you handle people's psychology. And I think this is why we're in such a difficult position right now, because it's been badly handled. There might have been another way to have handled it, rather than this swift, really very brutal attempt to get rid of it.
But in the last 10 minutes or so, I did want to talk about your wonderful book about Benazir Bhutto, The Fragrance of Tears, and your friendship with her, because as we've talked, my wife Diane and I have been reading it. I've read it. I found it very engaging, very informative, very measured, and I think quite courageous the way that you've done that. So you've said publicly that it was quite challenging to write. How has it been received?
Well, I think so far, you know, it's early days because the book's only just come out in the UK. I think people have been surprised by an enduring friendship across the cultures, and especially with somebody who then becomes a prime minister. I met Benazir Bhutto at Oxford, and I've often said, you know, you worry about so much about what you're going to study at university, but actually who you meet often can determine your career. And certainly my friendship with Benazir Bhutto determined my writing career, because I went to Pakistan, and consequently the whole interest in Kashmir arose and has remained with me ever since. But I was very fortunate, because I did have what I consider to be an extraordinary friendship with her. And it lasted for 33 years until her assassination in 2007. And I felt, in a way, I owed it to future generations to document what could become out of a simple meeting at university, and a journalist and someone who, by force of circumstance, became a politician, because she would probably not have become a politician if she hadn't stepped into her father's shoes after his execution in April 1979. But it was challenging, because unlike other books I've written, I am very much part of the story, and the story wouldn't have been the story without putting myself into the story, because in a way what I wanted to do was illustrate the East-West relationship over this period of 3 decades, which began in the late 1970s. And again, if we cast our mind back to the 1970s, it was pre the Iranian Revolution. We were remarkably ignorant about a country such as Pakistan. Probably the most we knew was 1947 independence, Pakistan, India, secession of Bangladesh in 1971, and that's about it. But we didn't learn that history at school. We were far too busy learning about Tudors and Stuarts and the sort of, European history and the 30 Years' War. And so when I actually changed the character of the friendship by going to Pakistan to be with her, it sort of stepped out from being just a social Oxford friendship into the real tough world. And of course, I was in huge culture shock. And that's what I wanted to demonstrate in the book, is how little I understood and as a representative of Western culture about an Islamic country, because we were not focused in those days on adhering to dress code, understanding Islam. That has all come in the 30 years since. But as I say, pre-Iranian Revolution, and I stepped off the plane in a short skirt and a t-shirt because I thought I was going to a hot country. The only person I knew in Pakistan was under house arrest. I had no other friends, no other contacts. And I thought it was, as I say, useful to sort of chart this as an illustration, both of the differences, and yet at the same time the strength of a friendship that went through all those cultural differences. And it wasn't an easy period, of course, as we know, and it had huge tragedy for Benazir, culminating in the ultimate tragedy of her own assassination. But I'm glad, that people have understood. I've not written it as a biography because, as a friend, I don't think one is in a good position to write a biography. But what I've written is to give insights into the challenges, and particularly the challenges of somebody becoming prime minister of an Islamic country, a conservative Islamic country. Ironically, you mentioned the sort of right-wingism that's prevalent. A lot of conservatism has come back into our societies, more so than was there in the 70s. And this is very much true for Pakistan, it's true for India, and as we've seen elsewhere in the world. And so I think, it provides, on a human level, the story effectively of a friendship, with the insights into what Benazir Bhutto had to undertake and what she managed to achieve. And I always feel that achievement of becoming prime minister, the youngest female prime minister of a Muslim country, in 1988, was a huge achievement.
And the other aspect of your book, which you start off not right at the beginning, but close to the beginning, is Benazir dealing with the hanging of her father and the judicial miscarriage of justice that involved. And I think that must have had a profound effect on her. And as you suggested, she felt obligated then to go into politics. And she was very brave and very persevering because of all of that, and suffered as these military dictators made her life really very difficult. And I think the way you've chronicled that is very interesting and very sensitive as well. So very well done. If you hadn't have got involved with Benazir Bhutto, though, and if you were going to follow the career of your father, you would have joined the Royal Navy.
I know, and part of me feels I wish I had as well. But one life is not enough. That's the problem. But having edited his memoirs, I feel I've walked a little bit in his footsteps as well. But yes, as I say, life is full of choices, and I think one of the things one's fortunate with is that there are choices out there, and you step into them, a door opens. And I often say this, and if I'm asked to talk to students, who might be disappointed they haven't got into a particular university, or they haven't got a particular job, one door shuts, another opens, and just go through that other door, because you never know. And certainly that friendship I had with Benazir Bhutto, which introduced me to working on South Asia, writing on Kashmir, a subject I care passionately about, has enriched my own life as a writer and a historian. And I think not being an armchair sort of expert, it has huge advantages, because you feel much more confident when you're talking. Of course, there's always more history to be learnt, and there's no such thing as anything definitive.
No,
but I think, it's a rich life if you've really followed very interesting stories.
Yes, there's a lot of choice and a lot of chance, and there's a mixture of the two of them. Victoria, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been, yet again, wonderful to hear your views and your opinions and your experiences. I really appreciate you being involved, and it's wonderful to speak to you again. So thank you very much, Victoria.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Victoria Schofield's book, The Fragrance of Tears, My Friendship with Benazir Bhutto, should be available in Australian bookshops by Christmas, and it is currently available online.